Hi, everyone. And hey, Lindsay. Oh, well, I guess I feel like I should be doing that, but okay. You're pouring water. So while she's doing that, I'm going to tell you about the first time I ever met Lindsay. So about 10 years ago, I was out at a conference at UBC, and we were standing next to each other, and we were chatting, and I was like, oh, she's so cool. So we were going into this event, and it was one of those events where people submit the first page of their manuscript, and then a panel of experts, of like agents and editors and other writers, they read through it and they give their feedback. And usually it's just like, a lot of times they'll like talk about like what to fix and stuff like that. So we're sitting there, and this most incredible piece of work comes up on the overhead projector. And it's like they're reading it, and it's just like just like a voice that you have not heard coming from a Canadian writer. And I was like, it's so good. And I looked at her, so good. And then, the whole audience is just like rapt. And the agent was just like, whoever this is, like, get in touch with me. And she like whispers, she's like, this is mine. And I was just like, that is so cool. So then we exchanged phone numbers, and I was like hoping that she would like text me. I think maybe I gave her my number and she didn't have a number or something. And I was always like waiting. And I was just like, is she ever gonna get in touch with me? And I was just like, okay, I don't know. And then I read an excerpt, and I was like, I don't know, this excerpt sounds like it's by Lindsay, but it's under like a different byline. And it turned out to be hers. And then just like coming up to her book coming out, I had the opportunity to copy edit it. So it was just like this amazing moment where this incredible memoir was like up on the screen, and yeah, just like got to read it and then work with her. And now we get to be here to celebrate her story collection, Tell Me Pleasant Things About Immortality. So we're just gonna let you hear her incredible voice. So Lindsay, if you can read from the book.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Doretta. It's been how many years since that conference? Like, I never expected us to meet again. I'm also very, so if you give me your number, I may or may not text you, just so people know. And thank you so much to VPL for hosting this, and thank you for that kind introduction, George. I'm gonna read a short excerpt. It's called Sorry Sister Eunice. It's about a bunch of sorority girls who are actually not sorority girls. They're actually holuchang, which are nine-tailed fox demons, and they're pretending to be sorority girls so they can actually eat people on campus. So this has a lot of cannibalism. I don't know what that says about me or what I was thinking during the pandemic, so don't judge me too harshly. We call Sister Eunice because her Rotan form is truly unrecognizable. Her Earth-like circumference and squat stature would probably be the same if someone brainy were to measure her ratio of gravity. All of us nine-tailed fox demons, except for Sister Eunice, are model thin, 5'9", and divinely beautiful in both fox and human form. Plus, like all holuchang, we have luxurious manes, angular features, and golden brown eyes. We look permanently photoshopped. Eunice's skin is potholed like a steamed rice cake. Her breath always smells like fermented dairy. The closest we've been to this sort of unpleasing odor was in the 15th century, when lice was rampant in the courts of the Yongyu Emperor. Even though none of us want to, Sister Eunice, we think she's hilarious. At group dinner tonight, she shows her swollen foot and missing shoe. I got so drunk this morning, I fell down the stairs, she says, pushing up her lenses that remind us of laboratory safety goggles. Then I woke up on the lawn, and I'd lost my jimmied shoe. Oh shit, you poor thing, we all exclaim. We do our best to tolerate Eunice because that's what good families do. Yep, she says, pushing her hair over her face like a shower curtain. 5th time this semester. Come to think of it, Sister Eunice has a bit of a drug and alcohol problem. Actually, we all do. You would too if you were mortal, over 600 years old, and masquerading as a 20-something-old Gen Zer in an all-Asian sorority, Sigma Omicron Pi, at San Francisco State U. For centuries, we Haluching have been migrating and shapeshifting into human form. We have traveled through the wild terrains of China, Korea, and Japan, destroying townships, marriages, and political careers with enthusiasm. Behind our penchant for destruction lies a manic appetite for human gristle. Once you've gnawed on a merchant on a ship to India, or a hopeful farmer looking for a wife, it's hard to be content with a stomach half empty with rabbit. Fox demons are selfish creatures, meant to inhabit caves in the black forests of Xinjiang alone. We are not meant to live as pack members at an old colonial mansion, protected by the collegiate moss and the genteel veneer of an ivy tower. It still baffles us that we are forced to share our prey, the frat boy who reeks of beer and the stoner loner with Dorito breath. We suppose it's just good table manners. During our bi-weekly group dinner, while sucking on tendons and crunching pelvic bones, we want to lunge and tear out each other's throats. But it's against house rules at Sigma Omicron Pi. Thou shalt not kill or maim a Halujing sister until threat of extinction is over. By dessert time, which is always raw liver, we think about smothering each other with fluffy pink pillows. By after-dinner drinks, we wonder why we don't just throw ourselves out a window. So Eunice, we say instead, forcing down our instincts for mass homicide and suicide, tell us what happened again to your shoe. What we don't tell Sister Eunice is that one of us stole her right Jimmy Choo after she passed out drinking a dozen rum and cokes. Sometimes, when we're intoxicated, we waltz into campus bars and shake our mortal asses to Ariana Grande and Drake. Sister Cece will badly karaoke to Aretha Franklin, while Sister Tiffany will jam her pink fox tongue down a young visiting scholar's throat. We clutch our gin and tonics to our chests, and because we are masquerading as oversexed sorority girls, we occasionally dry hump one another when we think people are looking. As the night goes on, we loudly sob-sigh for our former lives in Asia, for days of no electricity, pre-internet, when the Haluching were influential starters and manipulators of epic wars between fiefdoms. Under the bar's strobe lights, there's a cruel, scorching hope reflected in each of our gleaming corneas. We crave a permanent return to chaos in nature. It's hard to admit that we're practically irrelevant nowadays, that human beings no longer need the Haluching to assist them in the destruction of their own species. Thank you.
Well, I think you and I were discussing before, but after, hearing you read from that section, I was really thinking, what made you decide to link this Chinese myth with sorority girls? How did that kind of come together for you?
Yeah, I think I've always been really interested in how Asian women are portrayed in literature and media, and we're always seen as meek and submissive. And there's this myth in Chinese mythology where these fox demons, they're really badass. They come at people, they start wars, they make trouble, and they eat people. And I think that's something I was thinking a lot about. And so for me, I was like, well, what is scary and what eats people? Well, I guess a sorority person, metaphorically. I mean, they don't literally go around, at least I think so, right? And so it became really normal, or I guess natural for me to think about this could be a metaphor for the people who, they're immigrants, but at the same time, they're trying to make, I guess, a story for themselves, and yet in the story they're frustrated. And so it just hopefully became, a funny telling of what it means to be in a sorority. They don't necessarily like each other, they're stuck together. And I think that's also one of the themes in the collection, sisterhood and family.
Yeah, I mean, I was really thinking as I was reading the collection, just thinking about family as a source of inspiration for a horror story. I was saying to you earlier, just thinking about Hereditary, the Ari Aster film. So I guess, yeah, is that a place that you really draw from, just going in and just looking at family as a place where terror and just all of this kind of can spring from?
For sure. I mean, who among us doesn't think family is scary? I mean, can I get a show of hands? I mean, I think, family is where the horror can begin, right? I mean, family is complicated, it's fraught. we sometimes love each other, but sometimes we want to, I don't know, tear each other's throats out. And so for me, I'd written a memoir about the woo-woo, about a dysfunctional Chinese family. And then it just became really natural, I think, for me to want to explore the theme of horror. And one of the first stories, Happy Birthday, this dysfunctional family sits down, and I thought about it. Well, what happens if, the father is possessed by a serial killer? So a lot of short fiction is me. He turns out to be a serial killer. He's possessed by a stripper that he killed, so it's very dark. So I think a lot of short fiction for me is asking, well, what if? Like, what if the most horrible thing happens? Take a very complex situation and then add some demons, some ghosts, and see what happens to these poor people. Like, what would you do if you sat down to your father's 65th birthday dinner and he's like, well, I'm actually possessed by someone I killed, last night. And so I think that's what fiction is.
Yeah.
Or at least horror is for me.
And I think what's so interesting with what you do is just it starts out and it seems like it could be mundane, where it's just someone thinking about just their marriage, their the brand name things that they want to own, the money they're trying to get from their family, and then suddenly you're there and it's oh, it's not a regular day. It's very killery. In fact, one of the moments that I was pretty obsessed with was in Happy Birthday. It's just the question, does anyone who's anyone actually care if you're a serial killer these days? And that, I was just that's such a good line, because it's just we're living in this time where there's such a true crime obsession. One of our friends is a criminal defense attorney, and I was talking to her, and she was saying that maybe 10 years ago she would go to parties and she would tell people she was in WestJet operations, because otherwise people would get so upset if they found out she did criminal defense. But now if she says it, they're just oh, I love true crime. Mm-hmm. And then they want to ask her all about murdery things and stuff. So I don't know, was there kind of also an element of how just the everyday, it is dangerous. It is true crime moments can happen. And in many ways it's just you've taken these fantastical elements to it to be able to discuss some of the hardest and most violent and scariest things that we might possibly face.
Mm-hmm, for sure. I think with this world, especially with COVID and anti-racism against Asians, anything can happen, right? It's really scary. And I think in so many ways, if you were to take this collection and make it, I guess, realistic without these, fantastical elements or metaphors of horror, it would be unbearable. But then it also shows that, how desensitized are we as people, right? We talk about violence, we think about trauma, and I guess in so many ways, the collection is really about, being a woman of color, and being in this world and how we take that trauma. And also, I think the characters, they go through a lot, but they are able to endure and survive. And I think that's what it is. A lot of it is.
Yeah. And what's so interesting, as I was reading this, and we were talking about earlier, I had asked you, do you find that with fiction that you're able to get closer to the truth and just be brutally honest in a way that you weren't able to in memoir? And yeah, I guess you can talk a bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fiction, you can say whatever you want. I teach creative writing to my students. I tell them, oh, please lie to me. I want you to lie. I don't want to read anything truthful in your work. And I think that's the beauty of fiction. You can talk shit about people and not get sued, coming from a nonfiction memoir background. And, you can always say, this is a metaphor, this is a simile, no one has to know the truth, even if it happened to you, and we can talk about it later. And yeah, I think there's something freeing about it, because the truth, as we all know in creative nonfiction, there's so many ways of telling the truth. But in nonfiction, you're just so limited to the facts, right? It had to happen, or you can't put it in, or you get in trouble. With fiction, the truth is really up to your interpretation for the reader.
And there's so much room for you to just really explore those emotional truths, mm-hmm. and be able to set up those scenes. Just speaking on what you're talking about with just trauma and being able to speak the truth. I just was really taken by this part in The Ugliest Girls. And so these women, they're going to meet the mayor of Gold Mountain, and it's this whole metaphor where these girls have been taken, and they've been taken to Gold Mountain, and they think they're going to get married, and it's something else altogether. And it just really struck me that it's just like each guest would place a leech or 5 inside our hideous mouths, whatever could fit. One by one, we would be drained of our remaining memories and emotions. A renowned chef and confectionery maker would transform these leeches into sweets so that the white devils could enjoy the fattened leeches for their amusement. And I sat there and I read that. I was just like, oh. I was just like, isn't this a lot like what you had to do with your memoir, that you had to go on essentially a trauma tour and have people ask these questions and consume your life? And well, you were telling me earlier what the story was about. So yeah, can you talk a bit about that story?
I think with that story, The Ugliest Girls, it's about the idea of trauma porn and how, as women of color, sometimes we have to perform our trauma to be published or accepted in this industry of writing. And I think often, when I was touring, people felt comfortable asking me all sorts of really personal questions. It wasn't about the work. It was about me, the person, and I think, white male authors don't get these questions, or at least they are not expected to really give their trauma to their audience. And so I think that story was really a reaction to it, of being like, suddenly, here is my story, but it's not just my story now. It doesn't exist just inside the pages. And so often, memoir writers, the story is for the reader's consumption, yes, but anything outside of it isn't necessarily for them, right? There's still that element of privacy. And I think a lot of people don't really recognize with memoir, a lot of it's curated, right? The character's curated, the voice is curated. And so often I think there's this idea that, we have to share our trauma to do well, or at least in a way that people can understand it.
Yeah. And it's just like, why not recognize the fact that, don't want to make you blush, but that, you're a genius with language, and that, every time I read something in your writing, it's just like the sentence turns. It's not the word that we expect. It's a word that will make the moment more vibrant, that I'll get to see something from a different angle. And I think that's so much what I want when, I'm getting this opportunity to speak to you. It's just it's the craft of it. It's the work that you put into it. And so, yeah, it's just really exciting to be able to just ask these questions how'd you do this? How'd you do that? So yeah, in addition to just having these incredible mythologies to draw on, and essentially 5,000 years of history to kind of play around with, I guess what kind of inspired the book, in terms of just do you have horror influences, or were there certain writers that you were really thinking of as you were just putting together all of these ideas in the book?
Okay, well, I wrote this book completely by accident, like I do all books. It's never planned, or I think the first story, I'd written some stories in an MFA program, and then I think I never really set out to write horror. I watched, I think, The Shining growing up. My mom was always scared of that movie because Jack Nicholson was possessed, and for those of you who've read my memoir, ghosts were a big thing in my childhood. And so the idea that you could be a ghost and a writer, and I guess I'm writing horror stories. In terms of influences, I think I'm reading you, other Asian writers like Jen Suk-Fung Lee, and seeing how they were able to write their own stories. But I don't know if I was ever really a horror reader.
Yeah, so you weren't reading Stephen King with a flashlight and freaking out and having to explain why you haven't been sleeping or anything?
No, I know. I think my childhood was a horror movie, so I didn't need to.
you had source material to draw from.
Yeah.
You didn't need secondary texts.
Yeah, and I think I'm scared now to read horror and watch it. I live in Winnipeg now, which is very, very different than Vancouver. You have to put on 56 layers of clothing every time you leave the house. And it's not a city if you're not a driver. So I'll put on my like layers of clothing, walk to school, take everything off, teach an hour, put it on again, and then run back. So yeah, I think that's a horror movie. I'm going to be writing about, the minus 35, minus 40 winters.
And I mean, all these stories were completed before you moved to Winnipeg. So have you been kind of inspired by the Winnipeg landscape to kind of go in another direction with the speculative?
Maybe the Arctic horror, I don't know. Or maybe a memoir about like how do you survive winter in Canada. But I think it's been done.
And like, we have this. Sorry, I'm gonna open up to questions that I actually prepared because I was just like chatting and excited to talk to you. One of the things I was really interested in is just like seeing you make this like wonderful leap from memoir to your YA novel to these stories. So what was that like, just being able to, before just like telling a story over like a big space, and then just like having to kind of like put these big ideas that you have into the space of a short story? Like, yeah, what was that process like for you?
Really hard. I'm not gonna lie. I think I'm long-winded when I write, so it's easier for me to sit down and write a 300-page novel, for example. That's something I should be doing, but when I look at short stories, it almost feels like I'm making sausage. Like I have to stuff meat into a casing. It's a gross metaphor, and it doesn't fit, and I'm angry, and I have a lot of trimming. So it was a really hard process to do. So I admire, you and Sashi, who's in the audience, who can write these beautiful short stories because they're so contained, and every word, every image, every sentence counts in a short story. Whereas I think in a long form piece, it can be, you don't have that perfectionism, right? So I think that's something for me that I found really difficult. And in terms of genre, I don't really think of genre when I'm writing. It's really about storytelling. Can I tell a good story, and what form does it fit? So whether I'm writing memoir or YA or short stories, it's taking that story and trying to put it, I guess, in a casing. I don't know, I'm always making meat. I mean, meat metaphors. It's probably terrible and gross. I don't know where mine's at.
Well, I mean, I guess like it's like kind of like butchering, and like it's a whole thing, and maybe that's meat on your mind, cannibalism. It just kind of all came together there.
I'm gonna be the butcher of Winnipeg.
That's so terrible.
That's a great story.
It's writing itself.
I know.
Right, like after this, you're just gonna go. You're gonna get a 300-page novel out of it just because we had this conversation. It's just like Butcher of Winnipeg.
And I'm not gonna eat the students. I promised the dean that.
Was that like sub paragraph like 1 in your contract, like do not eat the students?
I think it just came out recently with this book. Right.
Right. It's like, okay, we have to send you a contract amendment. Please, like, no student eating. So. I don't know. One of the other things I was thinking about too when I was reading your work is that there's just like such moments where there's just like the meanness of character produces such comedy, and it really comes through in dialogue. And really made me think it's just like that kind of like Jane Austen ability to reveal character completely in just like a few lines of dialogue. And so in Tell Me Pleasant Things About Immortality, this woman goes up to the immortal and says, tell me how you survived. I can pay you whatever sum of money you want. I only have one child, and he doesn't deserve to inherit. And I just found that like so like hilarious and messed up. Like it just contained, it just like told an entire family story right there. Like I don't need to know any more about her. I don't need to know any more about her son. Just her saying that in this desperation, I could just like, it was like epic. It was like you did that incredible work of like the big thing, like squeezing the like pig into the casing, like in those lines. And so yeah, I was just like, is there something about like being able to like capture that meanness for like maximum comedy?
Yeah, I think First of all, I think mean characters are more fun to write than nice people. I mean, nice people don't belong in books, right? They belong in real life. And I think most of us, we have these horrible thoughts that we're scared to say, at least, 90% of us are. And so those of us who don't want to say them, it goes into fiction. And I think with this character, I was just really thinking about, how do I tell her story without writing pages and pages? And I guess, I'm glad that worked. And I think with this collection, a lot of it is about class, right? And money and immortality. I think I was also fixated on that during the pandemic as well. Yeah, I know, and I don't think her son deserves to inherit. Right?
Yeah, so like you know the whole like backstory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really thinking about how class is like so important in this book, and just even thinking about even just like 5 years ago, it's like when you were living with like many roommates, and you had the roommate who like clogged the toilet off all the time, and then your landlord would make you pay half the plumbing bill, just like struggling through that, like you were just like in the middle of like rewrites and like doing all the things, and just like seeing like that struggle with money across like different class lines in this book. I guess like I think like a lot of times like class isn't addressed, even though I feel like it's one of the most important things that defines like our lives, like right now, just like the economy, just like just like the struggles that everyone's having, and just like seeing like just like Vancouver, just like the widening gap between just like people who have a place to live and the people who don't, and just like what's happening right now in the downtown east side. I guess like as you were working through this, it's just like how did you like bring all that into just like stories that like have leeches that like take your stories and like get fed to other people? Like how did you do that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think I tend to write about obsessions that I didn't know I had until they materialized, and then I'm like, oh, so 5 stories have money in them, 6 stories have cannibalism. What does this say about me? And I think as I mentioned, like I was a struggling writer. A lot of people think I wrote the woo-woo, went on Canada Reads, and life changed dramatically. No, I had 6 roommates. I was living in East Van, making $12,000 a year, and of course a lot of immigrant families, you have really, really wealthy family members, and you also have really, really poor family members. So there's always that struggle or that divide, right? And you're always hearing growing up about so-and-so going on their 5th vacation, and then so-and-so can't afford to eat, right? And there's nothing really in between. And I think that's something I was always preoccupied with, because I grew up middle class. Then I was writing class. I don't think that exists. and now, I have a full-time job in Winnipeg, and now I'm middle class again. So it's been something, I think it's really interesting seeing that rise and fall. And I think my characters definitely embody that. Happy birthday, they're a wealthy family. And then there's, characters who can barely afford to eat.
I think it's like such an important discussion to have, because that's one of the things where like a lot of times like no one wants to talk about the fact that like there is the struggle, and it's just like there's the veneer of having to go out in public and like ironing your clothes and being like, I have like $10 in my bank account, but like we're gonna go do this thing. And I think like it's like not that writing is like a continuous struggle, but yeah, it's just that like it's just like it's not Instagram life. And I think people should know that if they're writing, it's like they haven't failed if they're feeling like it's hard to get through and the struggle and the whole thing. Okay,
for sure.
I'm babbling.
I have one anecdote. So when I was, I think I was like a finalist for this award in Toronto, and then I had to bus there because I couldn't afford cab fare. And I was carrying my dress, and I got changed in the bathroom, and I had to find someone to zip me up, right? And then everyone thinks it's a huge, glamorous event, but it's not, because you're taking the bus and you're getting changed in the public bathroom. So that's the life of a writer for anyone who's considering it. It only looks nice on Instagram.
Yeah, it's like, but the thing is, it's just like, the things that we'll do because like we love doing this. Like, can you imagine not writing? Like, what would it look like? It would be strange, right? Like that you wouldn't get to make stuff up.
I know. I would probably be a serial killer. I'm joking. I'm joking. No.
All right, let's keep Lindsay writing. So gotta give her the book deals, keep her not killery. Yeah. So, and like actually thinking about that, like one of the things is just even talking about like the opposite of like glamour, just like thinking about how like usually immortality seems so great because they always make immortality in so many works of fiction synonymous with eternal youth. And so you have like vampires and like they're like 17 for some reason. Like somehow they never get vampire-y like when they're like 70. Mm-hmm. So they're wandering around and they're like at like the peak of their like good health and everything, just doing a thing. And it was just like so refreshing to see like immortality like kind of suck. Like that like someone would go through this whole process, like all these people wanting it, but like it's just like, no, maybe in the end it's just like a whole bunch of suffering and then everything's falling apart.
I think it is. I really do.
Yeah, so if it's just like, I guess like what made you decide to like, yeah, just like strip away all of that like artifice and just be like, yeah, wouldn't immortality actually be like uncool after like 600 years?
I know, because nothing lasts forever, even body parts, right? And so I think I have that natural inclination to strip away the glamour and the gloss and make things grotesque, right? So I was thinking about, yeah, what if you got to live forever, but it wouldn't stay together? What do you do? So it was one of those questions of what if, right? I think a lot of my fiction is about that, right? Yeah. And that poor character, she doesn't get to stay together. And I was thinking about like, what if your mind was still intact, but your body doesn't work, or it, literally your ear falls off or something happens.
So one of the things that we've talked about just like privately with each other is that like a lot of times you get a lot of feedback that your work is weird. And I was thinking about just like the idea of weirdness. And as I read your work, I'm just like, I don't think it's so much a weirdness, so much as like, it's like such a, like, it's like a brutality that people don't expect. And I was really thinking about the fact that it's just like, for those of us who experience violence, like at the other end, like this would be the way to write about it. It would be just the most kind of like in your face kinds of moments where, the language would just kind of like smack you. And so I don't know, like, what do you think about that, like, idea of like people coming to your work and just not being able to connect with it in that way of being like, oh no, actually this does feel realistic even in its like fantasy elements.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes I ask like, well, have they ever been, a victim or experienced violence? I think some people have been privileged not to, and so for them, maybe it's the idea of gore or being hit in the face with these images that scares them. But also I think at the same time, being an Asian female writer, you're not supposed to write these brutal scenes, right? A lot of work about immigration is meek, it's docile, it's beautifully done, right? It's about trauma, but it's made in a way that people can understand, right? You're not supposed to be really open about it, I think. And I think that's the same thing with woo-woo, right? People were like, this book is so weird, it's not mainstream enough, no one's gonna connect with it. But hopefully, the readers who get it are able to see what it is. And again, going back to the emotional truth of fiction, right? These stories maybe could be told through personal essays, through research, but at the same time, why be contained by a single fact when you have universes and different people to tell multiple stories about?
Yeah, it's just like trauma, but make it fun.
Yeah, right? Because the horrible is hilarious, right? For a lot of people, you can't laugh without crying and vice versa.
Yeah, it's not just like a kind of like flat thing. It's just like, it goes like this.
Because you can laugh about, trauma many, many years later, like not in the moment, because that's terrible, but,
Okay. So I was wondering if anyone in the audience had questions, and I don't know, just imagine like if some of you were like writing things, like Lindsay is an amazing teacher, so I know that she'd be happy to answer questions about like, just like, yeah, the writing life, going about it, that sort of thing. Yes?
Yes, I'm very interested in, like, some writers, a lot of writers don't teach, and I'm wondering about that marriage, and I imagine it's a very different kind of process. Were you inspired by teachers of your own, or, I'm just interested about that crossover and what that's like for, I mean, you don't have to, obviously, this is your job now, to teach at a university, but, is it something that works well with your life as a writer?
Yeah. I think, when I was a creative writing student, that mentorship was really important, having that feedback, but I think mostly that encouragement, having someone sit down and tell you, this is good, but this needs a little bit more work. I think that's something really invaluable for students. And from, a writing standpoint, I'm engaged with writing every day. I'm looking at student manuscripts, I'm looking at my own work, I'm looking at, work from my colleagues and peers. And so it just seems so natural to be able to think about writing, to engage with it. Even when someone looks at a piece that is not quite finished, when you're engaging with it, you're thinking about it, it's really about the craft of the writing and really like how do we improve that work. And then when you approach your own work, sometimes it's in the back of your mind of, how I just told someone how to fix X, Y, Z, and now maybe I can do that too for my own work. So it's a very symbiotic relationship.
So you never feel it takes away from your creative life as, as a writer? Because it's a difficult life. You've already mentioned that it's difficult and it has different trajectories, right?
Yeah, it depends on the students. There's sometimes really great, really excited, passionate students, and those are the ones that you show up for. And of course, there's students who don't want to be there, and so it's really about, learning how much time one can give, right, to helping someone, and also, looking at your own craft too, right? So I think it's different for every writer, for sure. Yeah, thanks.
Yes?
Do you ever feel like you've hit your kind of peak of writing, I guess? I feel like when I'm writing short stories and I find a theme of like, okay, all my pieces are kind of surrounding this one theme, you ever feel like you're like, oh, I'm going to run out of things to do for this theme, I'm going to like burn out on this one topic, but like you feel like it's the one thing that like you kind of enjoy writing? Or I don't know. I'm just like, you think that you're only writing one thing, like, or fearing that you're gonna run out of ideas for it, I guess.
I think that's a good question. It's also a good sign, because I always tell students and aspiring writers, just follow your obsessions, because that's what's going to, create that book. And then ask yourself, where shouldn't I go with this story? Because that's where the answer is. Write about what you're not supposed to write about. And I think, obsessions change, right? You can write the same book many, many different ways, right? Because how many themes are there in life? And I think worrying about a topic can be limiting when you're writing. So I just focus on the story and what do I have to say about that? Because you can always take out a story later, right? If it feels too repetitive. So don't worry.
What are you working on at the moment?
I have a novel that I'm supposed to write. And it is, I guess, supernatural horror, satire, class, race, about these bridesmaids who accidentally sell their soul to a demon bride. It's a play on bridesmaid culture and wedding culture. So if you have never been a bridesmaid, I say, don't do it. It's a year of indentured servitude.
So I take it you've done it before.
Yeah. It's not a memoir though.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to get sued.
Hey, I guess you don't give off the "don't ask me to be a bridesmaid" energy.
I know, everyone asks me, and now I have to be like, if you want to be my friend, you cannot ask me.
Or maybe you just have to befriend either people who are already married or people who plan on never getting married. And then
That's
you don't
true.
have to have this
Yeah,
problem.
I have to, like, curate my friend list better.
No big weddings.
Yeah, or put in the friendship contract. I've been
Friendship contract.
I know I'm making people
I
sign
won't
friendship
kill you
contracts.
and
yeah,
don't make me a bridesmaid.
exactly, right? And then that way, we don't violate the contract. And I can like show up at your wedding and be happy and not angry.
Eat some food, dance.
Exactly.
Does anyone else in the audience have any questions? Oh, yes.
Go ahead. I thought it was really interesting when you said you write your books by accident and also that you write long. So I'm curious what your process is like for a single short story from beginning to end. Like, do you outline and then what does your revision process look like?
That's a good question. I think with short stories, I do follow a 3-act structure because that's what I know and I feel safe doing it. So I think I do a quick outline. I know where the story is going to end before I sit down to write. I think it's from a habit of writing novels. Like when you get stuck in the middle, you're like, what do I do next, right? So everything about the story is outlined. It feels scene by scene, and I just kind of flesh it out. And then in terms of process, I think it's really unwieldy. I'm not a neat, clean writer. It's messy and chaotic, and things are out of place. And then it's really about trimming and shaping. And then at the very end, when I feel that it makes sense, it's coherent, then I'll show it to a writing friend or something. But I think it's almost like a wild process. It's intensive. And when I'm writing, I can't socialize. It's very much like me, like sitting from the computer complaining to it.
And you had a question?
She basically took my question. That's all good. So yeah, for this book specifically, it's a beautiful title, by the way.
Thank you.
I guess my question now is, when did you realize that you had full material for a book, or from the time that you wrote the first story that's in the book to the last, like how long did this whole process take?
That's a good question. So I started writing this book when the woo-woo was being rejected. A lot of people think, that book was an overnight success. Like I've had people tell me like, oh, so did you just write it like last month or something and then you got it published? I'm like, yeah, right. So I finished my MFA and it really honestly took 6 years for it to find a home. And so, during the 6 years, I wasn't just, I was upset and I was looking for a job, but I had a lot of time because no one would want to hire me. Like even Starbucks was just like, you have an MFA from Columbia. Like, why would we hire you? You're going to leave next month. I'm like, no, I need a job. So I had a lot of free time. And so once I was sending my book to agents, getting notes back, I was just writing a bunch of short stories. We get more notes back. Okay, I'll switch over, write short stories. And then during the pandemic, I realized like, oh, I have 13 short stories. I have a draft collection. I think we were talking. And you're like, go for it. Just put it together. And I was like, okay. And I like ended up just, randomly stitching them together, sent them to my agent, and she sold it in a week. So I was pretty lucky. But that just shows like never throw away work if you're a writer. Just keep it all, save it all in that Google Doc, because one day when you're like, give me a manuscript, and you're like, hey, I have work that I forgot about.
You only have it in Google Docs? You don't have
Yes.
like a million backups? You just have it, you trust Google with your life?
It's safe, right? That's the only thing I know. Because I used to have those those flash drives, and I would lose them all the time.
You gotta have a couple more backups. You just gave me like the scare of my life. Like, please go home tonight and back up your novel onto something else.
Like,
What if hackers get into Google?
Like, what am I supposed to do besides Google Docs?
Just put it on that flash drive.
I always lose them, though. I hate them.
I don't know, like create like a thing, like put it on like a necklace. I don't know. Be like that like 80s latchkey kid. You gotta go around. Like you can't just keep it on Google Docs. I'm sorry, this is frightening me. Just like, what if we lose your bridesmaid novel?
Everything's on
to
Google
hackers?
Docs. It's been safe so far for like 5 years.
Oh my gosh. PDF it. You got to do something. If you have to email it to yourself, please PDF it and email it to yourself. Okay, as long as your email isn't also Gmail. Email it to your university email address. Sorry, everyone, making you go through this whole like IT like
No,
fear
Doretta's a
of
genius
drafts
about
thing.
things like that. I don't know. I'm always like, I guess Google Docs gonna work. I'm just gonna send you a link, okay?
Oh my gosh. Okay, yeah. We'll talk about this more later. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay. Yes.
Interesting how you came up with a young adult novel. It was always back behind and just come out like within about 6 months. Was it an old project?
Yeah, so the YA novel came about, well, a lot of people don't know that YA, a lot of it is IP, so it's commissioned by a publisher. And so I sold the Woo Woo, finally, it was coming out. We got, I guess, an email from an editor in New York who was like, do you want to write a YA novel about XYZ? And so they sort of just give you a synopsis, they give you the characters. And so that was something I ended up taking on. And so it was a really, really fun project. I think a departure from what I usually do, because my stuff, I think, is really dark, apparently. People have been telling me that. I don't think it's dark, but a lot of people do. And so this was a really a good opportunity for me to try something light and fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Last call for questions. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's a no, and I'll just turn it over. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, everyone.